You must wonder who this man is. I'm a taxonomist, which means nothing to you. I classify information, specifically perfumes. The fact is that it's very tough to sell perfumes. Until I came up with a common language that all the brands could agree on, there was no common language. And you brands didn't make life any easier because each of the perfumes you classified or described, you used different words. It was a cacophony of confusion. I'd found, though, that if you ask people for the names of their favorite perfumes, if you get 3 or 4 fragrances, almost invariably at least 2 of them fall into the same fragrance family. It's the logic of wine. If I ask you, what do you prefer, red or white wines, and you say you like white wines, what do I say? Do you prefer a Pinot Grigio or a Sauvignon Blanc or a Chardonnay? And instinctively, once you tell me that, it makes sense to talk about your thing. If you like a Chardonnay, would I be recommending a really rich Burgundy fragrant wine? No. And so logically, if I know that you like florals, or I know that you like ambery notes, or I know you like woody notes, why should I not show you more of that family? Am I more likely to get a sale? Yes, and that's how it all worked. Today, my team and I have classified, matched, with the help of the brands, with the perfumers, more than 57,000 fragrances, which has made Fragrance Finders possible. I created the first online fragrance finder in 1999 for an American site called beauty.com. I got caught up in the .com revolution at that stage. Today, we provide the content in the United Kingdom for the Perfume Shop, for Boots, in France for Marino, in 8 countries of Europe, in the Benelux countries for Essie Paris. Germany would be Douglas, Notino would be the giant Polish site. In America, we do Macy's and Ulta. And as of last year, we're now into China with Tmall, which is a fascinating development. Fragrance is my passion, fragrance is my life. And obviously, working with the brands and perfumers, I would become intrigued by the stories they were telling. Remember, when I started thinking of asking people, the perfumers were invisible. Today, they're stars. But back in the 90s when I started, nobody knew about them. Oh yes, people like Edmund Rudnitska, Guy Robert, perhaps Jean-Claude Helena were starting to become known. But they were unknown people in the main there. To my surprise, they were willing to talk. And then I had the luck to interest 2 masters. One was Guy Robert. Guy was the creator of Madame Rochas in 1960, Calèche for Hermès 1961, most of the early Gucci fragrances, Dior Essence for Dior, 69. At that time, he was president of the French Society of Perfumers, and I don't know why, but he listened to me when I said, I've got this idea. I want to write a little booklet about the real stories behind the great fragrances. Because the reality is that then as now, there was a lot of nonsense around. This one said this one said that. And there was no consensus. And I said, I want to talk to the perfumers. Would you help me? Something must have clicked, because I can't begin to tell you the help he gave me over the years. He became my mentor, my very close friend, and for the last 12 years of his life, the technical consultant for my reference book, Fragrances of the World. The other one was the master called Edmund Rudnitska, probably the most celebrated perfumer of the 20th century. He became famous in 1944 when he created Femme for Rochas, the first great post-war success. With the money that made him, because perfumers then were paid a commission, he set up his own laboratory outside of Grasse. He made relatively few perfumes in his life, but a number were masterpieces that changed the architecture of perfumery. Think, for example, of Eau Sauvage, 1966, the first citrus note that transformed eau de colognes into real, tenacious, yet still fresh fragrances. Think of Diorella, 1972, the first French fruity floral. Today we know many of them, but it was Diorella that was there. Or Diorissimo, for example, in 1956. The first pure, nothing to do with anything in the kitchen, spices, or any of those. I wanted to speak to Monsieur Rudnitska because he was the only living perfumer then who had started work in 1928 and had worked and had known people like Ernest Beau, who created Chanel No. 5, or, for example, Almaraz, who created all the Patou fragrances. Problem, He was a year older then than I am now, and he had a reputation, unlike me, of being a very grumpy old man at times. So I thought, what the heck? I wrote to him, and to my surprise, he agreed to receive me. I thought I'd get 10 minutes, but in our first interview, he gave me almost 3 hours, the first of 3. And I mention those two because those were the two people, Guy Robert and Edmund Rudnitska, who introduced me to at least 100, 125 of the 250 people I spoke to. I spoke to the heads of houses, Maurice Roget, the legendary head of Deal, who transformed the house with Poison and Fahrenheit, for example. Vera Struby, the angel behind Angel. Robert Ritchie of Nina Ricci. I spoke to the perfumer, Jean-Paul Guerlain, and all of them. I spoke to the bottle designers, Pierre Dinant, who created Opium, for example, the legendary bottle in 1977. He's 93 now, still working. We've shared a studio together in Paris for the last 23, 24 years. It is now. And he's still amazing. One of his latest creations is that phantom bottle, the one that looks like a little robot there. I mean, the imagination. At 93, I hope I'm still working at that stage. And out of it came a book, Perfume Legend. It was the first time that the perfumers, the creators, had spoken. Weird as it sounds, the reality is that in all the books on perfume, what you're reading are the interpretations of the authors about what they understood the perfumers were saying. I didn't. I wanted the perfumers, I wanted the heads of the houses, the bottle designers to speak for themselves. Now, that's not easy because no one speaks logic. Get a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this. My job was to string them together, put it to them and say, is this what you meant? That's what I did. Well, right at that start, I had intended to come out with American Legends. This was back in the early 90s. In fact, I'd spoken as early as 92 to one of the great perfumers, Josephine Catapado, who I wanted to speak to her about Fiji by Guy Laroche, one of the Floral Green fragrance. But she'd also created Youth for Estee Lauder and Norel in 1998. And so that was one of the first interviews I did. Over the years, I talked to many of the American perfumers. But still, I couldn't get down to actually finishing the book. The problem is, I have to classify fragrances. We were overwhelmed. You know, in the last 20 years, we've classified over 28,000 fragrances. And it just became overwhelming. Until COVID hit, then I couldn't stop it anymore. I did it, and now American Legend there. To the French, perfume is liquid. To the French, perfume is liquid art. The Italians, liquid style, but to the Americans, liquid money. Clash of art and commerce might be fierce, but that's America. It was Ernest Shifton, the father of American perfumery, who said that the story of perfumery is the history of our civilization. It didn't start well. The early American Puritans, perfume was the devil's elixir that took men away from their God-given role. Back then, perfume was the domain of the apothecaries. The earliest was Caswell Massey, 1752. And here is their number 7 fragrance, which was George Washington's favorite. He bought 2 cases, gave to the Marquis de Lafayette to thank him for his support of the 1780 war. The earliest American oil house or perfume house, remember if you would, these are the houses that actually create the perfumes. They're the ones that hire most of the perfumes. The number of brands that actually have an in-house perfumer are few and far between, but even those work very closely with the oil houses because these are the people who would actually do the research, come up with the new captive molecules, the new ingredients to use. The earliest one in America was Dodge, Coalfield, and Olcott of Brooklyn. In 1859, they started distilling aromatic raw material. John Blocky was the most innovative of the early perfumers. He started in 1865, faded, of course, but his house was revived in 2015 by his great-great-grandson, Tammy Kramer, and his wife, Tammy. Today, it is the only 19th century American perfumery company still run by the original family. The first American perfume to gain the status of a classic was Colgate's Cashmere Bouquet, 1872. It came out as a soap, and then within a couple of months with a perfume there. It was created by the Swiss perfumer William Ongaro, and its success launched Colgate into the fragrance business. When Colgate turned 100 in 1906, 100 in 1906, its catalogue listed some 625 different perfumes. Can you believe it? 1892, Avon debuted as the California Perfumery Company. David Hall McConnell sold books door to door. And to encourage sales, he took a letter from Estee Lauder and offered a gift with purchase of 3 California perfumes. Women preferred the fragrances to the books, and Avon and the Avon lady were born. By the turn of the century, Richard Hudnut, a Newhouse, was challenging Colgate and Blocky. Hudnut launched more than 90 fragrances, and shrewdly, he registered his company not only in America but also in France, which legally allowed him to declare on the bottles Richard Hudnut, New York, and Paris. Great commercial advantage. In 1836, Prince George's Machiavelli launched his collection that launched Prince Machiavelli fragrances. The bottles were designed by his wife, Her Royal Highness the Princess Norina. It all fell down on Black Thursday, 24th of October 1929. Wall Street crashed. Millions lost everything they had. But Elizabeth Arden soared. Harper's Bazaar had declared her as the mother of all beauty. Before Helena Rubinstein, before Estee Lauder, Elizabeth Arden was the first beauty queen. Here in this image is 1965 on her last visit to the United Kingdom. Forbes magazine reported that she had earned more money than any other businesswoman in the history of the United States. Bluegrass was her signature, and the reason it's in the book, it's her first international American success story. It was created by the French perfumer Henri Almaraz, who reinterpreted the lavender, jasmine, and spice accord that he'd created in 1929 for Jean Patou, Moment Suprême. Very spicy. 1990, Life magazine nominated Elizabeth Arden as one of the 100 most important Americans of the 20th century. The selection of legends in American Legends is deliberate. These are the fragrances that introduced a new note, a new scent, so different, so innovative, that 100 competitors flocked to copy it. Think of the isoe supermolecule that transformed Halston in 1975. Literally just brought the whole thing to life. Within a year, other competitors were appearing. Or introduced a new technology that changed perfumery. Think of Antonio's flowers with the headspace technology. Antonia Belanca disappeared about 15 years ago, closed her company. I thought she'd gone. I couldn't contact her, but on Monday, 3 weeks ago at IFF launch, she was there. It was so good to see her. Antonia's Flowers is coming back. IFF are reconstructing that headspace technology shortly, and she's still as beautiful a person as ever. So number one, innovative note, or number two, innovative technical ingredient, or number three, they made such an impact that they shaped a new trend. Think of Charlie in 1975, for example, or think of Elizabeth Taylor's Passion in 87, or CK1 in 1990. The world just flocked to copy those ones there. By any standard, Old Spice is a legend. Perfumer Annie Buzantin once said that when she went to New York, she thought the bluegrass was the fragrance that American women were wearing, and Old Spice, the scent of American men. Old Spice was conceived by William Lightfoot Schultz. He started in a New York loft, 28th Street, at the height of the Depression. He specialized in private label novelty soaps for the department store. 1937, inspired by the Rockefeller renovation of colonial Williamsburg, he introduced a collection of toiletries and soaps under the name Early American Old Spice. The next year, he came out with Old Spice. Here are the original bottle concepts by his designer, Leonard Edson, that I was able to obtain. Old Spice itself was fresher than the original Early American Old Spice. It was more citrus, but it was still sweet and spicy vanillic, very much like a scented Coca-Cola, if you would, very much in the context of American perfumery there. In many ways, it was reminiscent, for technical ones, if those of you are interested, L'Eau de Lubin, Lubin's first fragrance that came out in 1798, You have almost identical characteristics. And if you wonder why, the reality is the Luban was an early major French house that went into America there. The funny thing is that Old Spice never talked about the perfume. That was a no-no. They talked about refreshment, exhilaration, stuff like that. It was only in more recent years that they've talked about it in their marvelous campaign, Smell Like a Man, Man, which got some 60 million hits within a space of years after it launched. The 1930s and the 1940s were the era of the big bands. Potent white flowers dominated. Junker Gardenia, Elizabeth Taylor's favorite, 1938. One of the early perfumes made by a self-taught woman, remarkable for that reason. 1943 came White Shoulders by the inimitable Baron, regarded as probably the first great fragrance born in America. It was really a dominant tuberose note. Think of Giorgio before Giorgio. Then in 1953, the world changed. Youth Dew changed American perfumery. Estee Lauder's story is fascinating. He founded her company in 1946. By the mid-60s, her products, leaders in upscale specialty stores in America. They have the distinction between a specialty store that really focuses on fashion, cosmetics and stuff, and department stores like Macy's, which have a wide variety of specialty stores, a key to American upscale retail there. Well, by the 1980s, Mrs. Lauder was more royal than any royal. When it came to fragrance, she was the first one to put her finger on a problem. Perfume was the perfect gift. It was the perfect gift. The reality is that back then American women would no more think of buying a bottle of perfume for themselves than sending themselves a dozen red roses on Valentine's. Perfume was a gift, she suddenly realized. That was killing it. He was about to change that. In 1950, she'd introduced a range of upscale skincare. Remember that she was into skincare really at this stage there. It was called Esthederm Youth Dew, and that was where the name Youth Dew came from. 1953, she added a bath oil, Esthederm Youth Dew Bath. It was created by Josephine Katapana, who told me that Mrs. Lauder, she loved the scent, but she just wanted it to be stronger, more potent, more lasting, stronger, stronger, stronger. She pushed until no longer could the oil, the scent, be dissolved in the usual bath oil formula. It had to be blended with an insoluble oil called isopropyl merstrate. And what happened is that you put a few drops in your bath, it floated on top of the bath, a marvelous scent. As you got out of the bath, like a silken scented body stocking, it was all over there. There was a signature that evening. The day after, there was a trail, and the day after that, a hint. In a world of perfume pussycats, can you imagine the impact of the Youth Dew Tigress? Well, in 1977, Yves Saint Laurent paid Estee Lauder the ultimate compliment. Without knowing it, he copied Youth Dew for opium there. If Estee Lauder persuaded American women to buy fragrance, it was Playboy who gave American men the permission to indulge themselves. Here is the first Playboy from Christmas of 1953. Now, you probably think I'm going to talk about the Playmates. No, that's not the part that really intrigued me, even though they were lovely. What intrigued me is that the fundamental revolution of Playboy was not its centerfold Playmates, but its new model of masculinity. Playboy gave men the permission to indulge themselves, to spoil themselves. Change was already in the air. Canoe had led the way. In the mid-50s, Canoe became a cult on college campuses. More boys than girls wrote to Dana saying, "Where can we buy it?" The idea that men and boys would like a man's fragrance was dismissed. Elizabeth Arden, in one of her last statements, said, "Men will never wear perfume." She was wrong. And finally, in April of 1959, Dana introduced imported 4,000 bottles of Canoe. They sold out almost immediately. Sales doubled, then quadrupled, and just went sky high. Leonard Lauder was one of the first to read the wind. In December 1963, he launched Aramis at the Estee Lauder counters. Yep, I know that you, in your books, you'd probably be talking about Aramis in 1965. That is the Aramis master plan. The original fragrance I found was launched in 63, even though every perfume classification talks about 65. I found this out because one of the subscriptions I had in researching this book is a subscription that gives me all the ads in all the American newspapers dating back to 1850. And I plugged in Aramis, and lo and behold, what did I find? The advertisement for the 2 department stores who launched the fragrance that year. Estée Lauder knew precisely the fragrance that she wanted for Aramis. Eugène Grissanti, then president of IFF, the oil house, told me that she asked Bernard Champ, the chief perfumer, to take Cabochard, which he'd created in 1956 for Madame Gray, and make it into a man's fragrance. Leonard Lauder was hesitant, but Estée Lauder assured him that at the heart of every great man's fragrance is a great woman's fragrance, and she was right. Bernard Champ, the perfumer here, didn't copy Cabochard. He rebalanced the contrasting elements, rebalancing the mosses and adding more woods to it. But the line, sorry to say, didn't sell, said Estée Lauder. Back to the drawing. It was Brut who seized the Playboy philosophy and changed perfume history. They came out with a line that's probably the most successful line to ever sell a perfume. If you have any doubts about yourself, try something else. Suddenly, think of the implications. Suddenly they turned what was an effeminate product into a statement of confidence. It worked all over the world. When I was working on Perfume Legends, I spoke to the Hermès people, and my first question was, why didn't you come out, instead of Calèche, why didn't you come out with a man's fragrance? Hermès, leather, logical. They said, we looked at it, but the fact is that in France, men's fragrances were so small. There was Moustache from Rochas, but it was advertised by only about 6 ad pages a year. There was Pour un Homme, the 1930s fragrance from Caron, again, minor. They said it was Brut who actually made the market in France. It was the American fragrance's first international export of success. And it's that thing, if you have any doubts about yourself, try something else. Well, Estée Lauder was not too slow in taking this up. And in 1965, they relaunched Aramis with the Aramis Master Plan. It was a prescription made to measure for the Playboy generation, and Aramis was back on center stage. Mrs. Lauder's first love was skincare. But as youth dew evolved, she became more and more beguiled by the fragrance master. Ernest Shifton, IFF's chief perfumer, was her mentor. He had been an independent perfumer in Venice. He moved to Paris to escape the Nazis, and when they invaded Paris, he moved to the south of France. He was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, managed to escape and make his way to the United States. Guy Robert, my mentor, told me that Ernest Shifton knew every perfumer who counted in France. It was a time when they shared their knowledge and often their formula, and Ernest had them all. 1941, he went to see the Wertheimers, who, like he, had moved from France to Paris. They were moved from Paris through to America. They were Jewish too. And he proposed that they allow him to manufacture Chanel No. 5 in America. Remember, during the war, the oils could not be imported. France, Europe, and the bottles, nothing like that. Of course, he met a stony reception. No, they said, we will not show our formula to anybody. He said, I have it, here it is. And by the end of the world, IFF were manufacturing most all of the French fragrances in the country. If I look back, for me, 1968 was the pivotal year for Estée Lauder. That was the year at which she took on the fragrance industry. Estée was her signature. She hesitated about the name, thinking that people would laugh at her. She was finally persuaded to use it, and it was perfect. It was the first American fragrance that made the French perfumers sit up and take notice. If you smell First by Van Cleef & Arpels, Jean-Claude Helena interpreted some of the notes in Estée to put into that fragrance. Geoffrey Webster, the president of the Royal Bertrand, one of the great oil houses, called it the first American masterpiece. And certainly Estée was the beginning of the American influence on French perfumery. It was created by a remarkable perfumer, Bethy Bousset, who was off the wall. She refused to learn any technicalities, and if you didn't like what she offered you, she'd just throw it away in the sink. And some masterpieces went down the sink. She also created Chloé, for example, the original Chloé, not the new one, that was 1975. She was a genius, but Ernest Shifton loved her. He would test anybody, and she was originally a secretary, and he discovered she had a very good taste, really interesting nose. But look at what Mrs. Lauder accomplished. There was Estée of 68, 72 Alliage, the first sports fragrance, green and glorious. 73, private collection, a personal fragrance. It's still so complex that it's really hard, even with all the technicalities, to try to get a decent match to it. Then came 78, white linen, and 1985, beautiful, the last fragrance on which Mrs. Lauder worked. About 2/3 of the way through, an allergy stopped her sense of smell, and she handed development over to Evelyn Lauder, who transformed a lot of what had happened. In just 17 years, Mrs. Lauder had transformed American perfumery from ordinary to extraordinary. And so Estée came at a time of the other great fragrance called Norel of 1968. I know that many of you know nothing about Norel, but for me it remains one of the American pivotal ones, because nobody had anticipated in 1968, when Charles Revson put Norel into specialty stores, that it would be a hit. It was more than a hit. It was so spectacularly successful that for the first time, American corporate muscle started to look at American fragrances and say, maybe there's some money in them, the hills. Remember, in the United States, back in the 1960s, perfume was a lot different. The specialty stores hardly bothered about it because they did not believe that their customers, the wealthy ladies who lunched, were that interested in perfume. Perfume was for ordinary Americans. And where you could buy perfume was in the drugstores. Even Chanel No. 5 was a drugstore perfume at that particular. And so perfume was largely a none of it. Suddenly, up came Charles Revson of Revlon with this hit of Norel, and nobody had accepted it. As looking back, for me, it was Charles Revson on the left there, and Norel's success that inadvertently opened the door for Estée Lauder. Because the stores that she was in, the Saks Fifth Avenue, the great specialty store, they really weren't interested in fragrance. Suddenly they took one look at Norel and said, I might be interested. And really, Saks Fifth Avenue was her territory, and now they were interested. Norel and Estée, between the two of them, ushered in a decade of extraordinary fragrances. Look at this. Aromatics Elixir was first off the rank in 1971. Carol Phillips, the president there, had asked Bernard Schock to create a fragrance because Bernard had worked with Estée on Estée itself and aromats there. She didn't like what he offered her. She felt it was too intellectual. She herself loved Calandre by Paco Rabanne, a green aldehydic fragrance. Anne Gottlieb, who was direct the development of the Calvin Klein fragrances later, had been working with aromat on a patchouli note. And hesitantly, she suggested patchouli. Bernard Schock listened, took it in and said, yeah, I like that. And 2 trials later, Aromatics Elixir, originally called Aromatics, was born. 1972 came Alliage. It was created by Francis Camaille, who was later to create Charlie and Giorgio, and originally was created for Manuel Ungaro because Chanel was about to license it. But the two of them did not get along, so she took the fragrance back and put it into Estée. 1973, Musks hit us. Jovan Musk, created by Dennis McAdam at Jovan and Mario Moscona at IFF. It got to a point that within 8 years, almost 25% of all bottles of fragrance sold in America were Musk scents there. My personal favorite remains Tea Rose. As I look at the perfumer's workshop that Gun Buckner, who headed up Perfume's workshop, had introduced in Bloomingdale's in 1970. In many ways, it was the first American niche collection that came about. This was a fragrance, if you've never smelt it, of such potency that you couldn't get rid of it. Their favorite technique was to go into any stores and the staircase rail that went up between floors, they would just walk casually over it with a pad that was saturated with tea rose, and without looking, just wipe it up there. I tell you, when you went down that stair, there was no way that you could escape the scent of tea rose there. Well, if that's what started, by 1975, the world changed. Before Charlie, men bought perfume for women. After Charlie, women bought fragrances for themselves. Charlie spoke to a generation of women who were moving in America from homemakers to the office. For the first time, they had money. And Charlie said, don't wait to be given perfume as a gift. Buy fragrance for yourself. Wear it all day, any day. It's yours. Charlie liberated fragrance and turned an elitist gift into an everyday pleasure. By the end of the 70s, women were spending more money on buying perfume in America than men were spending on giving. Charlie was followed by the utmost of elitist fragrance from Estee Lauder. While the Lauder was moving down market with Charlie and Tea Rose, Lauder was moving up market, the first American house to do so. 1973, her inimitable private collection, created by young perfumer Vincent Marcello, who went on to create Z14 for Halston, and then, for example, Yataghan for Caral. In the book, there is a marvelous story he tells about the sensitivity of Mrs. Lauder's nose. No, I'm not going to tell you what it's all about. I want you to read it because the woman knew scents. No, she was not a perfumer, but she was every bit a perfumer in her ability to detect and identify what she didn't like. And her development of private collection extraordinary. In 1975, Halston. Halston was the Yves Saint Laurent of America. And his signature fragrance had such spectacular sales that within 2 years of its launch, it was making more money than the whole of Max Factor, its owner's US profits. $64 million of pure profit was coming. Norell's success and Halston's profit opened corporate eyes to the potential of fragrance licenses. But it just so happened that it was the baby boomers' growing appetite for luxury labels that finally convinced corporate America to back American designers. It was perfectly timed. Think of Halston, think of Anne Klein, think of Bill Black, think of Oscar de la Renta. I could go on and on and on. This was the golden age of American designers, and it happened just as the great department stores in the cities were moving out into the malls, because that's where the baby boomer clients were. Do you know that the French never picked that up? For 10 years afterwards, till the mid-80s, they continued to focus on the great center stage city stores, and they missed the opportunity that was happening in the baby boomer market. They left the field wide open. 1977, Oscar de la Renta transformed Floral Oriental or Floral Amber fragrances. Yes, I know. There had been beauties. Think of L'Oregan in 1905. Genius in its time. Le Bleu, probably the most beautiful or the Belle Epoque fragrances from 1914. Or what about Bal Versailles from 1962? But despite their beauty, as a category, floral amber, floral orientals remained a minor category until Jean-Louis Chazak transformed Le Bleu into champagne perfume. Its inspiration was Le Bleu because that was Francois de la Renta, Oscar's wife. He was an editor of Vogue, and she loved Le Bleu, and she said to Jean-Louis, I want that. Wisely, he didn't copy it. He simply took the elements and transformed it into a fragrance that was perfect. Well, within 10 years, 200 other floral orientals had flocked to copy Oscar. The most successful Vanderbilt, 1982, created by Sophia Kloss. The 70s were also the decade of Ralph Lauren. Comes to making brand magic, nobody topped Ralph Lauren. For his first fragrance, he worked with two colleagues from Aramis, George Friedman and Robert Ruttenberg. They had proposed Aramis, or they had proposed Ralph Lauren to the Lauder family for a number of years, but it never came about. And so finally, they asked Leonard Lauder if they may leave and develop the fragrance. He said yes. He gave them permission, but he said, you can't do anything for a year. Don't think he realized that that gave them a year to fine-tune everything that they needed. So by the time the year was up, boy, Lauder was ready to launch. George Friedman knew exactly the kind of fragrance he wanted. He'd been working on an Aramis 900 note, but he wanted it to be more woody and leathery. He spoke to Carlos Benaim, one of the great young perfumers then at IFF, and by accident, Carlos had been working on a green patchouli note, but it was far too strident, far too strong, so he toned it down. He told me that he added the tobacco accord and a leather effect to bring it into tune with Ralph Lauren, the polo kind of idea. But mod after mod after mod was going through the track until one evening, George Friedman wore the latest mod at a dinner. Virtually everybody said, George, what are you wearing? Boom! And that was the launch of Polo in 1978. 1978 too came white linen. I don't know if you know, but it was part of a mix and match collection. Yes, this was before Jo Malone of 1990. It was part of a collection of New Romantics, white linen, Celadon and Pavilion. It was too early. It didn't work, and Celadon and Pavilion faded, but white linen continued. It was manufactured by a younger version of one of our greatest perfumers, Sophia Grossman. She started 5 years before White Linen was launched. Ernest Shifton, the IFFG perfumer, had asked her to work on a Joy Accord, a really strong rose accord, but he said, make it cheaper, as everybody does. And she'd been working on it, and she went to see him, and he liked it very much. Now, he himself had been working on an aldehyldic accord based on Capricci, Nino Ricci's fragrance. And he was looking for something to hang it on. He smelt Sophia's rose note and said, let's put the two together. And that was the birth of White Linen. In the book, you will be fascinated by how Mrs. Lauder discovered White Linen and the tussle that took place between Ernest Shifton and her friend. But I'm not going to spoil the whole ambit. Well, if the 1970s were the golden age of American perfumery, American fragrance has exploded in the 80s. First came Giorgio. In 1973, Charlie changed the world. In 1977, opium shocked the world. And in 1981, Giorgio turned the world upside down. Fred Hayman, the owner of Giorgio, had wanted to launch the fragrance at Giorgio's upcoming 20th anniversary party on Beverly Hills. But there was no fragrance. Gail, his wife, led the search. He spoke to oil house after oil house. In each brief, it seemed to change. The oil houses could not come up with anything that remotely satisfied. Finally, they gave up. She told me that all I knew is that my customers wanted a Socko fragrance, whatever that meant. Search was going nowhere until David Horner was brought in as her consultant. David is a remarkable man. He has a mouth that is not the most polite. And he used to work for Charles Revson as his executive assistant, which meant that he was the man sent in to sort out any problems around the world. He was the only man I understand from people in the company who spoke back to Charles Revson, who was a difficult man, bully and stuff, but God, he had his finger on the button of what would persuade you to buy. He too tried oil houses, couldn't get anything to satisfy Gail. Finally, he turned to a colleague he'd known from his Revlon days, Jack Friedman, who was president of Florissant. It was Jack Friedman who'd made the great fragrances, Charlie, John 2, and others, or Ciara, or Revlon. Friedman was not interested. Why should he be? Giorgio, no matter how prestigious, was a single boutique in way off Los Angeles. But David is persuasive. And finally, Jack said, oh, okay, David, but there's only one that I'm going to send you, and you may not change it. Yeah, said David. You can imagine it. Yeah, no problem, won't change it. Meanwhile, he was going to get it changed. Jack Friedman said, David, no change. Yeah, David, I mean it. And in the book, you'll read about the way in which they came up in a way that allowed Gail to think that her instructions had been changed without changing the glue. Friedman believed in Giorgio. He'd never explained why. It had started as a project to give to Estee Lauder a floral version of Youth Dew. It was created by Francis Camaï, who also created Alliage, and was called Cinq Fleurs, 5 flowers. Well, Lauder turned it down. It was then shown to Germain Montet. It was shown to Helena Rubinstein. Revlon looked at it for Scoundrel in 1980. Yves Saint Laurent considered Cinq Fleurs for Paris in 1982. And after each submission, Cinq Fleurs was slightly modified, but Friedman never gave up on it. He believed it with a passion. Why? He never explained, but as I look at that scent and smell it, to me it contained the essences of the 3 great fragrances that in his mind he created for Revlon. It has the freshness of Charlie, it has the tuberose of John 2, and it has the ambry notes of Ciara. Giorgio is more important, though, than just the fragrance. Giorgio was the first fragrance that persuaded the great stores that perfume was not just a nice accessory, but a core product, because it brought customers through the door. You went to New York, you went to Bloomingdale's to have a look at what Giorgio is doing, and its stock turn was phenomenal. It also invented scent strips and exploded with over 100 million in a single year there. In 1985, Beautiful marks the changing of the guard. It's the last fragrance on which Mrs. Lauder worked, and what resulted was a masterpiece of fragrance engineering. On Lauder's side, there was Mrs. Lauder, Evelyn Lauder, and Karen Curry, the long-time evaluator who'd worked with Mrs. Lauder since 1982. On IFF side, the perfumers chosen a team of 5 perfumers. It was at a time that Mrs. Lauder was obsessed, by the way, with the success of Giorgio. And so that was the background that led to the development. Bernard Shaw came up with a fragrance that he felt had merit. But it was immense, page after page after page after page, and wisely he broke it into parts. And he gave the parts to a number of perfumers. To Sophia Grossman, she worked on the rose part. She was the queen of roses from Paris and Tresor and others. Nick Calderon worked for a year on a green irisy number 19 accord there. Carlos Benaim worked on 2 accords, a powdery rosy iris note and an orange flower. And Max Galvary out of Paris pulled it all together with. The result was extraordinary. But when you look at Beautiful and compare it in the same year to Obsession, it's day and night. It's amazing. Obsession marked the real birth of Calvin Klein. He'd had a perfume before, but it was totally forgettable and had long gone. Well, at Calvin Klein, Robin Burns, who had directed the success of Giorgio Bloomingdale's, was brought in to head the company. Had a tough job. For the first 9 months, Calvin Klein refused to talk to her because he couldn't get along with the Minnetonka, the company that had bought his particular brand. But she put together an extraordinary team of salespeople, evaluators, and designers. Among the evaluators, Anne Gottlieb was brought in to work on the development of the fragrance. Pierre Denon, who'd created the opium bottle, was brought in to work on the obsession bottle. The original name was Climax. Yep, absolute Climax, but they couldn't register it because of Klima by Longcom at that one, so they chose Obsession. It was created by Roer, by Bob Slattery. He's dead now, sadly. Not that creative. It was really a Masticatia du Soir, the green oriental note with a jolt of Shalimar put in. Perfumer Jimmy Bell said to me he swore that there was also a touch of the fruity Chypre note from Mitsuko, but I've never picked that up. I'm very strong on the oriental notes. Obsession changed fragrance marketing. Calvin Klein staked $15 million on the launch press and TV advertising, backed by 25 million scent strip samplers. In essence, it marked the start of the big bucks. Poison, for example, was to follow up with a $40 million 18-month campaign to launch Poison internationally. Obsession was the signature of the 80s. Sex was everywhere. Then AIDS hit. By 1980, the sexual revolution was fading. In an age of AIDS, romance and commitment were becoming the important criteria. And Calvin Klein's 1986 marriage to Kelly Rector was to provide the inspiration for eternity. The fragrance was created by the maestro of rose, Sophia Grossman. She took a fantasy freesia accord and layered it on top of a white rose note. And then the fun started. Anne Gottlieb was developing it. And she insisted that it needed cleavage. Now, I tried to understand what cleavage meant, but that was Anne's comment. It needed cleavage. She told me, she said, if there's no bosom, the fragrance is not going to be memorable. I said, Anne, what makes an American fragrance memorable? And her answer was, you need to take 2 steps back from a fragrance like Eternity, great American fragrances. She said, because up close, the notes can sometimes be a little harsh, but when you let them step back in the air, they're gorgeous. And that's the spirit of American perfumery. Well, in 1994, CK1 changed a generation. Shared fragrances are not new. In the 1970s, Yves Saint Laurent introduced free water, Eau Libre. Today, it's another fragrance, but back then, it was a unisex shared fragrance. They didn't use that word then. And these things come and go, but in 1994, Calvin Klein introduced CK1. It was inspired by Alberto Moreas, one of the great Swiss perfumers. Years before, Maurice Roget, the head of Dior, the man behind Poison and Fahrenheit, had asked Alberto to work on a Dior Man's fragrance based on a tea note. And he'd worked on that, but the Dior Man's fragrance didn't go ahead. But nevertheless, he'd continued to work on it. And when Anne Gottlieb spoke to him about CK1, that was the fragrance starting point that he chose. He knew he had to make it more lasting, and so he added a mix of 4 musks. It still wasn't lasting. And for more than 18 months, it went back and back again. Hundreds and hundreds, exaggeration, I don't know, but that's what he said. Hundreds and hundreds of mods, and still it wasn't lasting enough. But he had to go back to Europe And so the brief was taken over by Harry Mon, who finished it. No, that's not a quick job. It took Harry some 7 months in total to finally get CK1 to a point that when you wore it, your skin just blossomed with the fragrance. I have to add, though, that the key to Calvin Klein's fragrance success was Anne Gottlieb. For me, there are 3 amazing evaluators in the history of American perfumery. One is Jenny Soresi, who was head evaluator, odor evaluation for IFF, and the first woman, the first evaluator, in fact, to be put in charge as chief perfumer or chief head of the perfumers. There was a revolution when that happened. Nobody had ever thought that an evaluator. Remember, if you would, what does an evaluator do? A creator finds it difficult to judge his or her creations. And so you need somebody who's not involved in the creation to evaluate it, to give you a feeling, are you on the right track or not? If you try to both judge and create, you're going to end up in a horror story. That was Jenny Soresi, a genius in the film. Then I think came Corinne Curry of Estee Lauder. She started with Estee Lauder in 1982 and a genius for me. I owe much of the Lauder stuff in the book to the hours and hours and hours that she spent with me over the years. And then I have to pay tribute to Anne Gottlieb. She was the woman behind Obsession, Eternity, CK1, and so many other American great fragrances. Well, towards the end of the 80s, 2 fragrances emerged that changed our world. One is Passion. Everybody underestimated Elizabeth Taylor. Nobody expected Passion to succeed. We'd all say, oh, come off it. It's not going to go. I mean, who wants her? She's old and far beyond it. But then nobody anticipated the public frenzy and the crowds that greeted Miss Taylor. I was in Dallas when it was launched at Neiman Marcus there. 10,000 people were outside the store, desperate to get in there. 5 oil houses were briefed, 5 fragrances created. Elizabeth Taylor loved the one created by Jimmy Bell and Renee Morgenthaler. Did you know that she made more money from her fragrances than from all of her movies put together? I once asked why, and the answer that I got was she was the only celebrity who went into the stores to hustle the fragrances, and that worked. Well, 1989 came Red Door. 1980s were an age of blockbusters. Think of Giorgio, Obsession, Passion, Poison. And then in 1989 came the one just as potent, Red Door. Elizabeth Arden was suffering. They were fading. Bluegrass was non-entity. The Runitska fragrance from 37, It's You, was too intellectual and faded. Memoir Cherie, do you remember Memoir Cherie? Hardly there. They'd launched Cabriole, a ballet fragrance. It didn't click. And so they were looking for a fragrance. And it was Joe Spellman, the executive director, who one day asked casually at a meeting, he said, what would you call an Arden fragrance? And Mark Rosen, the packaging designer, peeped up and said, Red Door. Everybody said, you've got to be kidding. Who wants to smell like a Red Door? Because they were pretty horrible by that stage, thank God. But they were right in that kind of thing. The fragrance was created by a duet of perfumers. It was created by Carlos Benaim and by Olivia Guillotin. They were the perfumers who also went on to create White Diamonds, which was the fragrance that heralded the 90s. We knew that Elizabeth Taylor, we knew that she wore Jungle Gardenia, Giorgio, Isatis, and Poison. In other words, all potent, ambery, white flower notes. The message was clear. But it wasn't until a visit to her home that Carlos realized how fascinated she was with the smell of narcissus. She was growing narcissus in the garden. And that was the key. But narcissus is not an easy scent to interpret in a perfume. The molecules keep flying all over the place and not holding true. It took them some 7 months to create it. But that was the success of White Diamonds. 1991, that's now 34 years ago. It still remains one of the top American perfumes internationally and is about to restage in America. In the 1990s, environmental and health concerns were uppermost. In fragrance, overpowering scents like the 80s potent ones were out. Instead, lightness, transparency were in. And pleasures led to a generation of clear, transparent, clear fragrance. But Corinne Curry, the Lauder evaluator, was not about to promote invisible fragrances. I remember her telling me, she would tell the perfumers, give me tone, she would say. Give me texture. Let me touch the petals when I smell the fragrance. Well, the result of that was created by two perfumers, the transparent green airy bouquet by Annie Buzzantin and the pink pepper signature that you get by Alberto Marez, who also did CK1, if you remember. The 1990s were a happy time for Elizabeth Arden and for Estee Lauder, but for most companies it was disaster. For most companies, their fragrance sales plunged dramatically as Bath & Body Works took the market from nothing in 1990 to more than $1 billion in 1997. They'd exploded. And the fragrances that they introduced, the style, they called them affordable luxuries, were light, easy to wear, inexpensive stuff. It made all the 80s blockbusters, kind of, oh, look, old hat. And so many of the brands were faced with big slashes to their sales. At the same time, the Gulf War, you might remember, that it blocked duty-free sales for a period of years. Now, what do you do if you're a marketing executive for one of these great brands? Regardless of the impact of Bath & Body Works, regardless of the Gulf War, you still have to make a budget. So what do? You go discounting. So discounting became endemic in America in the late 90s. And if you had that fragrance in one of the great specialty stores, what would they do? They'd have to discontinue it, because customers would buy opium, for example, for $35 at the discount store, go to Nordstrom and say, please, can I have my $42 back? It went out. The question is, what would these great department stores replace those brands with? Well, in France, the solution was there. Back in the late 1970s, niche perfumes had evolved. What do I call niche perfumes? Niche perfumes for me are the single malts of perfumery. Individual, interesting, sometimes difficult, passionate fragrances created by many people with not that much money, not great brands, not research, not market research or anything else like that. They're individual fragrances. Well, it started in '78 with Jean-François Laporte, who opened L'Artisan Parfumeur. When that opened, he had been PDG, president of Sisley, the upscale skincare company. He was a chemist, fascinated with perfume, and one day a friend who was going in fancy dress to a party at the Folies Bergère asked him to create a banana scent for her to accompany a banana outfit that she was wearing. People loved it, she loved it, and so other people asked him, and he thought, I love it. And that's when he started L'Artisan Parfumeur as the first term. He became the model of what would become niche fragrances. Probably started with passion, no research, minimal advertising, if any, the same bottle throughout all the fragrances to emphasize the experience of the individual fragrances. Stories, authentic feelings replaced ads and stuff like that. And it worked. Well, in London, Sheila Pickles, who had been Franco Zeffirelli's PA, acquired Penhaligon's, the great Victorian perfumery. Zeffirelli himself was adored Penhaligon's fragrances, and it was he who probably lent her some of the money to acquire that one. And so niche started. Then in 1981 came Anique Goutal, 85 Matra Parfumerie Gantier, 89 Ethro, and 1990 Jo Malone in London. Passion, not marketing, is dictating all of this. So when you look back at the unique circumstances, in 1990s, Bath & Body Works exploded. The Gulf War stopped duty-free sales worldwide. Brands suffered. They had to turn to discounting in order to make budgets. That meant that the great specialty stores had to discontinue this. What did they replace it with? They replaced it with these niche fragrances. Did they find customers? Yes. A generation of women and men who'd grown up loving the fragrances of the 1970s, loved the impact of American fragrances in the 80s, now are willing for a new experience. And then the final thing happened in 2005. Social media started on the internet. And I remember once talking to a Procter & Gamble conference, at which I said at the end of it, I said, I hate to tell you, but you're no longer in control of your brands. The perfumistas are. This is going to be the new world. For me, in America, I identify Laurice Ramey of Bond No. 9 as the niche pioneer. In the 1980s, she put in Anique Goutal. In the 1990s, she developed Creed and continued. And then in 2003, she came up with her own brand. She had the sense to interest major perfumers, not just little people who are looking for some extra business. Maurice Roussel, for example, of Simrise. Dave Appel, Aurélien Guichard. Marvelous fragrances there. But 20 years ago, who would have thought that two guys with just $200,000 would have been able to create a brand that would challenge the giants? 2022 Women's Wear Daily asked industry insiders to nominate their greatest fragrances of all time. Greatest fragrances of all time. Number 1, no surprise, Chanel No. 5. Number 2, Santal 33. Fabrice Penot, Eddie Ross-Key, and Frank Vogel had created the most cultish fragrance of all time. If I look back, you can see the evolution that has taken place. In the 1970s, 380 fragrances. 1980s, 730. Boom, we got explosive. In the 1990s, 3 times as many, 2,100. In the 2000s, 8,600. And in the second, 2010s, 26,700. Since then, of that 26,700, 10,600 were niche fragrances. In effect, what niche has done is to encourage every other fragrance, luxury, prestige, mass and masstige, celebrity, to come up with a collection of fragrances. And that is what has excluded this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of how fragrances to Americans became not just liquid money, but liquid luxury. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was so insightful, so interesting. Your knowledge is unbelievable, and the people that you've met, you know, it's just, gosh, people we've dreamed to meet. So thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure people have questions. We've got Jessie and Georgie with mics now, if you'd like to ask any questions. And obviously, if you'd like to purchase one of Michael's books, we do have some with us today, which is fine. And there's a 20% discount. So it's a book you really do.
If I may just explain by the book, thank you for the coffee table. I set out to create a textbook for marketing and strategy in perfumery. There is no book in which you can read the words of the creators, the perfumes, the visionaries behind the scenes. Are they relevant? I think when you read them, you're going to see the strategy that Elizabeth Arden had with Bluegrass in 1934 is still valid under certain circumstances today. What Estee Lauder did can still be used today. We tend in marketing to think that what's old hat, not interesting. That, I suggest, is a mistake. The book is primarily an MBA for fragrance, marketing, and strategy. That's the only book in which you can read what other people say. By all means, read it for pleasure. The stories dip into. More than that, it's a textbook. Thank you. What can I answer?
Questions, Michael?
Yes.
Yes,
Oh, I like you running like that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely mesmerizing. Thinking about heritage fragrances, do you feel like a lot of houses are looking after their heritage fragrances more, or should they?
When you talk about heritage, define for me.
So, for example, Balmain relaunching or relaunching as a fragrance house, do you think they should be looking back in their, for example, Jolie Madame, which happens to be a huge favourite of mine, or do you think they should just leave those in the past and go with completely new?
My belief is that you can have your cake and eat it. I would recommend that for the old fragrances, they do their damnedest to create them as perfumes and work with the oil houses who originally created them to try to restore as close as they possibly can, because there's some raw materials that they can't use, parts they possibly can, as a heritage collection. It's going to be a minor part of it, but it provides them with the assurance of heritage. But otherwise, their future must be firmly on the future.
May I ask a very short follow-up question?
Of course.
Sorry, I won't monopolise. Do you think that consumers, the public, are now more interested in looking back at these historic fragrances and finding out about them and then wanting to purchase them? And then do you think that, for example, if they want to smell the original opium and then they buy black opium, obviously that is not the original. Do you think there is a lot of confusion with using those classic names and then a new market not getting that? Yeah.
Total confusion. Yes, it's. I don't think people really know much about perfume, you know, and they've vaguely heard of some of these names. But if you say to them, "Is this the original opium?" they wouldn't know it either. When you have a house like a Balenciaga that has had such kudos, for example, in the fashion market, yeah, anything you introduce under that will be possible. Balmain, the verdict's open. Is Balmain yet famous enough to revive the fragrance band? Question mark. Kind of. Likewise, Tom Ford fascinates me. And by the way, one thing you haven't asked is why didn't I include a Tom Ford fragrance? I would have loved to. Black Orchid would have been my one. I approached everybody. I sent books in. I explained. I got nothing back. There was this perception that Tom Ford was above it. So regretfully, unless I can talk to the creators, it's not in the book. But just in case you ask, that's one I would have loved to be in the book. Does that help you?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Suzanne.
Has someone else got the mic? No, I've got the mic. Okay. So I love art. I love Basquiat. I love Freud. I love Botticelli. If you could tell me what you believe would be the masterpiece in terms of the art of fragrance, what would that be?
Masterpiece, the art of fragrance. Existing?
However you want to interpret that. So
For the new generation, I would suggest Baccarat Rouge.
love that. Yeah.
If I were doing another book, I'd put Baccarat Rouge in it there. What other niche fragrances come in the top 20, number 20 sales in America? I mean, it's got that big, it's huge. You see, we don't create legends, you or I. It's people who create them when they talk about them. Do I believe in advertising? No, I don't. All it does is maybe make you aware to try a fragrance. And then it's when you talk to a friend about it. Estee Lauder was right when she said, talk to a friend, get them to talk. That's what creates legends. Does that answer that?
Great answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. I've really enjoyed that talk. It was really, really interesting. And one thing I wanted to ask you, as someone who's a journalist, but also who works with brands on sort of copywriting and so on, do you find it difficult to get answers from the perfumers that you feel are perhaps independent of any marketing influence or brand influence?
Interesting question. As a journalist and also a marketeer, is it difficult to try to get the perfumers to talk openly and honestly about their perfumes? Yes and no. I'll talk to them because they know that I'm impartial and independent, and I'll quickly pick up a whiff. And apart from that, when you go in to talk to any of these people, you have to be prepared a little bit. I mean, if you wonder how I got them to talk, it's not difficult. I would try to find something that they wouldn't expect me to know. I'd explain what I wanted to do. I'd show them when I had the book published, Perfume Legends, I'd show them that. And we'd probably talk. I'd probably introduce myself for maybe about 5 minutes, and then I'd ask a question, and they would start talking hesitantly, probably in corporate language. And then they'd stop talking, and I wouldn't say a word. And you know, silence is rather difficult. I would always sit down, and I would always try to have my eyes lower than they are. Well, because, you know, they're opening up, and I'm not. I'm just listening. And I wouldn't take my eyes off them. I would just be totally fascinated. It would be recorded, but I'd be totally fascinated. And I'd just look. When they stop talking, I'd just keep quiet. And people would sooner or later start talking again. And then I might say something which indicated that I knew something they wouldn't expect me to know. And from then on, the whole tenor would change and they would talk. You know, the rarest thing in today's world is actually to have somebody listen to you with total fascination about something that you love. How many times have you actually had somebody so absorbed in what you're doing or what fascinates you that they just let you talk? I remember Eugene Grisanti, the president of IFF, we had 3 interviews. And after the third one, and during the third one, he said, "Shit, this feels like a psychoanalyst session." But people get that wrapped up in it, you see. So it has to be gentle. Don't expect they'll come out with everything to start.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.